September 19, 1944. A foggy morning near Arracourt, France. Lieutenant Edwin Leiper is scanning the horizon when suddenly, just 30 feet away, a German tank gun emerges from the mist. He's outnumbered, outgunned, and facing the most feared tank in the Nazi arsenal. Within 5 minutes, his crew will destroy 5 German Panthers. Within an hour, they'll knock out 15 more. And they'll do it in a vehicle that American generals initially refused to use. This is the story of the M18 Hellcat, the tank destroyer that military leadership rejected, but would go on to achieve the highest kill-to-loss ratio of any American armored vehicle in World War II. A design so radical that it broke every rule about tank warfare, and a weapon so effective that German tank crews learned to fear its distinctive silhouette more than any other Allied vehicle. This is how speed defeated armor, how innovation triumphed over tradition, and how a car designer from General Motors changed the course of armored warfare forever. To understand why the M18 Hellcat was revolutionary, we first need to understand the crisis that created it. By 1941, America was watching Europe fall to a new kind of warfare. Blitzkrieg, lightning war. And at the heart of this terrifying military revolution was the German Panzer. The images coming out of Poland, France, and North Africa told a frightening story. German tank columns were smashing through defensive lines that had taken months to build. They were encircling entire armies. They were moving so fast that traditional military tactics became obsolete overnight. The U.S. Army was facing a nightmare scenario. They were about to enter a war against an enemy that had spent years perfecting armored warfare, while America's tank force was woefully unprepared. Our standard tank, the M3 Lee, was a design compromise that mounted its main gun in a hull sponson rather than a rotating turret. It was outdated before it even rolled off the production line, and intelligence reports suggested that by the time American forces reached Europe, they would face even more formidable German armor. But there was an even bigger problem than just having inferior tanks. It was the American military's fundamental misunderstanding of how modern armored warfare actually worked. The U.S. Army had developed a doctrine that sounds absurd today. Tanks should not fight other tanks. Let me repeat that. The official doctrine stated that American tanks were for supporting infantry and breaking through defensive positions. If enemy tanks showed up, that was someone else's job. This thinking led to the creation of a separate branch called the Tank Destroyer Force. Their mission was simple in theory, but disastrous in practice. Create highly mobile units that would race to wherever enemy tanks broke through, ambush them, destroy them, and then relocate before the enemy could respond. It was defensive warfare trying to be offensive. It was reactive when it needed to be proactive, and it was based on assumptions about German tactics that would prove to be completely wrong. Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Davis Bruce, who would later become a general, was put in charge of this new tank destroyer force in 1941. Bruce was a brilliant officer who understood that mobility was the key to success. He envisioned fast, agile vehicles with powerful guns that could outmaneuver heavy German tanks. He wanted cruisers, not battleships. Speed over armor, firepower over protection. The ability to strike hard and disappear before the enemy could strike back. But what the Army gave him was the M10 gun motor carriage. The M10 was built on the chassis of the M4 Sherman tank. It had good armor, a respectable 3-inch gun, and it weighed 30 tons. It could reach a top speed of 30 miles per hour on roads, maybe 20 cross-country. Bruce hated it. It was too slow, too heavy, too much like a tank. It couldn't execute the hit-and-run tactics he envisioned. It couldn't outmaneuver German armor. It was exactly what he didn't want. He rejected it. Then they offered him the M36, which was essentially the same M10 with a bigger 90mm gun. He rejected that too. The Army kept trying to give Bruce heavier guns on heavier chassis, when what he was asking for was the exact opposite. He wanted something that could do 60 miles per hour, Something that could flank German positions before they even knew it was there. Something that treated speed as its armor. Meanwhile, the clock was ticking. American forces were preparing for the invasion of North Africa and then Europe. They needed tank destroyers, and they needed them fast. The Ordnance Department made attempt after attempt to meet Bruce's requirements. They tried mounting a 37mm gun on a light tank chassis. Too weak. They tried a 57mm gun with a Christie suspension. Not powerful enough. They tried a 75mm gun in an open turret on a modified light tank. Getting closer, but still not right. Every prototype had problems. Engines that couldn't deliver enough power. Suspensions that couldn't handle the weight at high speeds. Guns that were either too weak or too heavy. It seemed impossible to create a vehicle that was fast enough, powerful enough, and reliable enough to meet Bruce's vision. By late 1942, the tank destroyer force was being equipped with vehicles that nobody really wanted, using tactics that wouldn't work against the Germans, preparing for a threat that might overwhelm them. And then, in a completely unexpected move, the Army did something radical. Instead of going back to the Ordnance Department for another military design, they turned to the civilian automotive industry, specifically to the Buick Motor Division of General Motors, and even more specifically, to a design studio run by a man who knew absolutely nothing about military vehicles, but everything about making things go fast. His name was Harley Earl, and he was about to design the deadliest tank destroyer of World War II. Harley Earl was an unlikely candidate to design a weapon of war. He was General Motors' chief designer, the man who had created the concept of planned obsolescence and annual model changes in the automotive industry. He designed cars that were sleek, fast, and stylish. He understood aerodynamics, weight distribution, and most importantly, he understood how to make vehicles that performed beyond their specifications. But he had never designed a military vehicle in his life. When the project landed on his desk in late 1941, Earl approached it like he would approach any other design problem. He started with the requirements. The tank destroyer force wanted something that could reach 60 miles per hour. It needed to mount a 76mm gun, the same weapon being developed for the new Sherman tanks. It had to be reliable enough for combat operations. And it had to be light enough that its speed wouldn't destroy its own suspension. Earl's solution was radical. Instead of starting with a tank chassis and trying to lighten it, he essentially designed a racing car and then figured out how to mount a gun on it. The result was the T-70 prototype, which would eventually become the M18 Hellcat. And every single design choice was controversial. Let's start with the armor, or rather, the lack of it. The M18's hull armor was just 12.7 millimeters thick. That's half an inch. The turret was 1 inch thick at its strongest point. To put that in perspective, the German Tiger tank had 100 millimeters of frontal armor, 6 inches. The Panther had 80 millimeters. Even the standard Sherman had 51 millimeters. The M18 could be penetrated by armor-piercing .30 caliber rifle rounds under the right conditions. Testing showed that at 75 yards, 9 out of 30 armor-piercing bullets penetrated the turret side. This wasn't a tank. This was barely even armored. It was a gun shield with an engine. The military establishment was horrified. How could you send American soldiers into battle in something that offered almost no protection? What about mines? What about artillery fragments? What about machine gun fire? The design seemed suicidal. But Earl and the engineers at Buick had done their math. Every pound of armor was a pound that slowed the vehicle down. And their philosophy was simple. The best armor is not being there when the enemy shoots. The weight savings from minimal armor went into the engine and drivetrain. The M18 used the Wright R975 radial engine, a 9-cylinder aircraft engine that had been proven reliable in other applications. Early models produced 350 horsepower. Later versions with a supercharger pushed that to 400 horsepower. But the real innovation was the transmission. The M18 was equipped with the 900T Torquematic, the first automatic transmission ever used in a military vehicle. This wasn't just a convenience feature. In combat, An automatic transmission meant the driver could focus entirely on maneuvering without worrying about gear changes. It meant faster acceleration out of ambush positions. It meant one less thing that could go wrong in the chaos of battle. The transmission had 3 forward gears with overlapping ranges, optimized for different speeds. First gear, up to 16 m/s. Second gear, 12 to 34 feet. Third gear, 30 to 60 m/s. And one reverse gear that could hit 20 points, which proved invaluable when you needed to back out of a firing position quickly. The engine was governed to prevent speeds over 55 km/h to protect the drivetrain, but even that governed top speed made the M18 the fastest tracked vehicle in World War II. Some crews reported hitting 60 mph on good roads. The suspension was another innovation borrowed from automotive engineering. The M18 used a torsion bar suspension system that provided a remarkably smooth ride. This wasn't just about crew comfort. A smooth, stable platform meant more accurate shooting on the move or immediately after stopping. It meant less wear and tear on the vehicle. It meant the M18 could operate for longer periods without maintenance. The ride quality was so good that crews compared it favorably to passenger cars, not to other military vehicles. The 76mm gun was mounted in a fully rotating turret that could traverse 360 degrees in just 24 seconds using an electro-hydraulic system. Compare that to German designs. The Panther's turret took 60 seconds for a full rotation under ideal conditions. The Tiger took even longer. Later in the war, some German tank destroyers didn't have rotating turrets at all, relying on hull traverse to aim. The M18's turret traverse gave it an enormous advantage in fast-moving engagements. If a German tank tried to turn its hull to bring its gun to bear, the M18 could circle around it, keeping its gun pointed at the target's vulnerable flanks. The gun itself could depress 10 degrees and elevate 20 degrees, and the breech was tilted 45 degrees to the right to make loading easier in the cramped turret. The vehicle carried 45 rounds of 70 cm ammunition, 9 in the turret ready rack, 18 in each hull sponson. The main gun could fire up to 20 rounds per minute under ideal conditions, though sustained combat rates were lower. A 50 caliber Browning 8mm Tudor machine gun was mounted on a flexible ring mount at the rear left of the turret for anti-aircraft and anti-personnel use. The crew consisted of 5 men: commander, gunner, loader, driver, and assistant driver. Here's where the design got even more interesting. Both the driver and assistant driver had complete sets of controls. If the driver was wounded, the assistant driver could immediately take over without any complex changeover procedure. It was a redundancy built into the system that would save crews more than once. But perhaps the most innovative features were the ones designed for maintenance. Remember, this vehicle was designed to be fast and light, which meant it would be pushed hard in combat. The engineers knew it would need frequent maintenance, so they designed the vehicle to make that maintenance as quick as possible. The entire drivetrain could be removed from the hull by disconnecting it from the drive shaft, attaching extension rails, and sliding it out through the front hull. The engine could be slid out on an integrated rail system through the rear access door for bottom-side maintenance without full removal. These weren't features you'd find on most military vehicles. These were automotive engineering solutions applied to military problems. The first pilot model was delivered in April 1943. All 6 prototypes were completed by July. And then came the testing. The M18 was tested at the General Motors Milford Proving Ground, the same facility where Buick tested its passenger cars. It went through the same grueling automotive tests: top speed runs on a banked oval, ride quality tests over specially designed bump courses, water fording up to 6 feet deep, wall climbing, ramming through structures. Every test revealed problems. The engine had issues. The automatic transmission needed refinement. The front shock absorbers were too weak. The gunner needed more working space. Every problem was addressed, refined, fixed, And then something remarkable happened. The 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion, which had been training on obsolete M3 gun motor carriages, was selected to test the new T-70 prototypes. Their testing record was described as superlative. They loved the vehicle. They made suggestions, most of which were incorporated into the production design. They developed tactics specifically designed around the M18's speed and agility. They proved that the concept worked. In March 1944, the T-70 was officially standardized as the 76mm gun motor carriage M18. Production had already begun in July 1943 at Buick's manufacturing facilities, running parallel with prototype testing. Original plans called for nearly 9,000 M18s to be produced, but the actual production run would be only 2,507 vehicles completed by October 1944. Why so few? Because the Army establishment still didn't believe in the design. The Armored Ground Forces wanted the heavier M36 with its 90mm gun, even though it was slower. The tank destroyer force itself was being downsized due to policy changes that favored towed anti-tank guns. And potential Lend-Lease customers, Britain and the Soviet Union, had little interest in the design. Only 7 were ever exported for evaluation, but the most telling rejection came in January 1944. When General Omar Bradley, commander of 1st U.S. Army, refused the new M18s when they were first offered to him. His units in England had trained on the M10. He wanted the M36. He saw no need for this light, fast vehicle with thin armor and a 76mm gun. So the first 3 M18 battalions sent to Europe went instead to General George S. Patton's 3rd Army. Patton, who understood speed and aggressive maneuver, would put them to better use. But even Patton had his doubts. The design was too radical, too different, too risky. The M18 Hellcat was going to have to prove itself in combat, and it was about to get that chance. The first M18s to see combat weren't even production models. They were 5 T-70 prototypes, shipped to Italy in spring 1944 for field testing. They arrived just in time for the breakout from the Anzio beachhead, one of the most brutal battles of the Italian campaign. The 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion received 2 prototypes. The 894th Tank Destroyer Battalion received 3. The 894th actually assigned their T-70s to the Battalion Reconnaissance Company rather than combat companies because the vehicles were so fast that they seemed more suited for scouting. The initial feedback was mixed. Crews loved the speed and the power of the 76mm gun. They were impressed by how quickly the vehicle could accelerate and how stable it was even at high speeds. But they had serious concerns about the thin armor and the cramped interior. Living in the vehicle was uncomfortable. The small internal volume made ammunition handling awkward, and the open-topped turret, while providing excellent visibility, left crews feeling exposed and vulnerable. Crew confidence was a significant issue. No matter how fast you are, there's something psychologically intimidating about going into combat in a vehicle that can be penetrated by heavy machine gun fire. But it was the 805th Tank Destroyer Battalion that became the first full battalion equipped with production M18 Hellcats in the Italian theater. They operated through the summer and fall of 1944 and began developing the tactics that would define M18 operations. The key was using terrain and speed together. The M18 would move fast to a firing position, engage targets from ambush if possible, and then relocate before enemy artillery or counterfire could range in on them. Shoot and scoot. It was exactly what Andrew Bruce had envisioned back in 1941. Meanwhile, in England, 3 M18 battalions were preparing for the invasion of Europe. The 603rd, 704th, and 705th Tank Destroyer Battalions. All were assigned to Patton's 3rd Army, since Bradley had refused them. These units landed in France in July and August 1944, and by September, they were pushing eastward as part of the Allied advance across France. They were about to participate in a battle that would define the M18's reputation for the rest of the war. September 1944, Patton's Third Army has been racing across France, with a speed that has shocked both the Germans and the other Allied commanders. But now they're running into stiffening resistance. The Germans are reorganizing. Fresh panzer brigades are being formed and thrown into battle. And near the town of Arracourt, east of Nancy, the Germans are preparing a major counterattack. Their goal is to cut off Patton's advance, recapture key terrain, and stabilize their defensive line. The attacking force includes elements of the 113th Panzer Brigade, equipped with the newest German tank, the Panther. The Panzer V Panther was one of the most formidable tanks in the world. It weighed 45 tons. Its frontal armor was 80 millimeters thick, sloped at 55 degrees, making it nearly impervious to most Allied tank guns from the front. Its 75mm gun was longer and more powerful than anything the Americans had. It could penetrate a Sherman from over a mile away. The Panther had been designed specifically to counter the Soviet T-34, and it could handle anything the Western Allies could throw at it. Or so the Germans thought. September 19, 1944. Dawn. A heavy fog blankets the fields around Arracourt. The 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion has been attached to Combat Command A of the 4th Armored Division. Company C has been sent to defensive positions near the small village of Réchicourt-le-Petit. Lieutenant Edwin Leiper commands a platoon of 5 M18 Hellcats. His mission is simple: hold this position and watch for German armor. The fog is so thick that visibility is down to about 30 feet. Leiper is standing in his turret, scanning the gloom, when suddenly he sees it. A German tank gun, the massive barrel emerging from the fog, pointed directly at him. 30 feet away. For a split second, time stops. Then training takes over. Leiper drops into the turret and starts shouting orders. His gunner is already traversing the turret. The loader slams around into the breach. The M18's gun barks. The German tank, a Panther, shudders and begins to smoke. But there's no time to celebrate, because more Panthers are emerging from the fog. The Germans have stumbled into Leiper's platoon positions in a meeting engagement that neither side expected. In the next 5 minutes, Leiper's platoon destroys 5 Panthers. One M18 is knocked out, but the Germans are now aware of the American positions, and they're trying to maneuver. More Panthers appear, trying to flank the M18 positions. This is where the Hellcat's design shows its genius. The M18s don't sit still and trade shots with the Panthers. They can't afford to. One hit from a Panther's 75mm gun will go straight through their armor. Instead, they use their speed. They relocate constantly, appearing from unexpected directions, firing, and vanishing before the Panthers can return accurate fire. Sergeant Henry R. Hartman's M18 becomes the star of the battle. Hartman has positioned his vehicle in a spot with good fields of fire and covered withdrawal routes. Over the next hour, his crew knocks out 6 Panthers, 6 of the most feared tanks in the Wehrmacht, destroyed by a vehicle that many American generals thought was too lightly armored to survive in combat. Hartman's tactics are simple: identify target, fire rapidly and accurately, observe hits, and if the target isn't destroyed immediately, relocate before counterfire arrives. The Panthers are powerful, but they're slow to traverse. By the time a Panther's turret swings around to where an M18 just fired from, the Hellcat is already somewhere else, setting up another shot from a different angle. By the end of the day, on September 19th, Leiper's platoon has knocked out 15 German tanks. 2 M18s have been destroyed. The rest are still operational. But this is just the beginning. The Battle of Arracourt continues for 3 more days, and the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion is in the thick of it. The Germans throw more armor into the battle, trying to overwhelm the American positions. But the combination of M18 tank destroyers, Sherman tanks, and American artillery proves devastating. The German tanks are technically superior in most ways, but they can't cope with the tactical flexibility of the M18s. When the battle finally ends on September 22nd, the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion has knocked out 39 German tanks. They've lost 4 M18s destroyed and 3 damaged. That's a better than 5-to-1 kill ratio against Germany's best armor. The M18 has proven itself in the most dramatic way possible. News of Arracourt spreads through the army. The vehicle that Bradley didn't want, that the armored ground forces tried to cancel, that skeptics said was too lightly armored to survive, has just achieved one of the most lopsided victories in armored combat. Suddenly everyone wants M18 Hellcats, but production has already been curtailed. Only 2,507 will ever be built, and most have already been delivered. The battalions that have them will keep them. But new battalions will have to make do with M10s and M36. The M18 has won the tactical argument, but it lost the procurement battle. To understand why the M18 was so effective, we need to understand exactly how it fought. Because the Hellcat didn't win through superior armor or firepower. It won through tactics that maximized its unique characteristics. The M18 operated on principles that were fundamentally different from traditional tank combat. Let's break down the anatomy of a Hellcat ambush and see why German tank crews learned to fear this vehicle. First, positioning. The M18's speed meant it could reach ambush positions before the enemy expected any opposition. While a Sherman might take 15 minutes to lumber into position, a Hellcat could cover the same distance in 5. This allowed M18 crews to set up ambushes along likely German approach routes, often in positions that would be impossible for slower vehicles to reach in time. The commanders would select positions with good fields of fire, ideally with a slight elevation advantage and multiple covered withdrawal routes. This last point was critical. Every M18 position was planned with the assumption that the crew would need to retreat quickly after firing. Second, the engagement itself. The M18's 76mm gun, with standard armor-piercing ammunition, could not reliably penetrate the frontal armor of a Panther or Tiger at combat ranges. This was the gun's biggest weakness, and critics pointed to it constantly. But the M18 wasn't designed to shoot Panthers and Tigers from the front. The tactics called for flanking shots, and from the side or rear, the 76mm could defeat any German tank. The key was using the M18's speed and turret traverse to get into position for that flanking shot before the German tank could respond. Panthers had notoriously slow turret traverse. The Tigers were even worse. If an M18 appeared on their flank, they had to rotate their entire hull to bring the gun to bear. That took time during which the Hellcat's gunner was putting rounds into the side armor at the rate of 1 every 3 to 4 seconds. When HVAP, high-velocity armor-piercing ammunition, became available in fall 1944, the M18's capability increased dramatically. HVAP could penetrate the Panther's turret front at 1,000 meters. It could defeat the side armor of any German tank at any combat range. But HVAP was never available in quantity. Most M18 crews had to rely on standard ammunition and good tactics. The open-topped turret, which seemed like a fatal vulnerability on paper, proved to be an enormous advantage in practice. Hellcat crews had vastly better situational awareness than their opponents. They could see threats approaching from any direction. They could spot targets faster. They could coordinate with nearby units more easily. And in the chaos of combat, information was often more valuable than armor. Third, the shoot and scoot withdrawal. After engaging, the M18 would immediately relocate. The automatic transmission meant this could happen fast. No grinding of gears, no delayed acceleration. Just smooth, rapid movement out of the firing position through pre-planned withdrawal routes. The M18 could be a mile away before German artillery could range in on where it had been. And then it would set up another ambush from a completely different direction. German tank crews reported that the M18s seemed to be everywhere at once. They would take fire from one direction, turn to engage, and find the target had vanished. Then fire would come from a completely different direction. This psychological effect was almost as valuable as the actual kills. German commanders became hesitant to advance when M18s were reported in the area, not knowing where the next ambush might come from. The M18's effectiveness was enhanced by excellent crew training. The tank destroyer battalions had trained together for months before deployment. They had developed unit cohesion and mutual trust. The commanders and gunners had practiced rapid target acquisition and engagement. The drivers had learned to handle the vehicle at high speeds over rough terrain. The assistant drivers could take over seamlessly if needed. This training paid enormous dividends in combat. A well-trained M18 crew could engage, hit, and relocate in under 30 seconds. That's barely enough time for an enemy tank crew to identify where the shot came from, let alone return fire. But the M18 wasn't perfect. It had significant limitations that crews had to work around. The thin armor meant that any hit was likely to be catastrophic. Artillery fragments, mine explosions, even large-caliber machine gun rounds could penetrate. Crews learned to be paranoid about exposure. They avoided open areas. They used terrain obsessively. They never, ever sat still in one position for long. The cramped interior made ammunition handling difficult. The 9 ready rounds in the turret were quickly expended in a serious firefight, and reloading from the hull sponsons while buttoned up was awkward and time-consuming. Many crews practiced rapid reloading drills until they could do it by feel in the dark. The 76mm guns' high-explosive shells were disappointing. They were much less effective than the 90mm shells fired by the M36, or even the 3-inch shells of the M10. This meant the M18 was less useful in infantry support roles, where high-explosive fire was more important than armor penetration. Some battalion commanders complained that the M18 was too specialized, good at killing tanks, but not much else. The open top created problems beyond just vulnerability. The crew compartment was essentially open to the weather. In the cold, wet winter of 1944-45 in northern Europe, M18 crews were miserable. The air-cooled engine pulled cooling air through the crew compartment, turning the vehicle into what one crew member described as an armored refrigerator. It proved impossible to seal off the crew compartment from these drafts. Crews wore every piece of cold weather gear they could find, and still complained about the cold. Maintenance was a constant concern. The M18 was pushed hard in combat, running at speeds and over terrain that would destroy a civilian vehicle. The transmission, while revolutionary, was also complex and occasionally temperamental. The engine, stressed by high power output, required frequent maintenance. But the design features that made maintenance easier paid off. Crews could perform needed repairs in the field faster than crews of other tank destroyers. This kept the M18s operational at higher rates than equivalent units with heavier vehicles. One often overlooked advantage was the M18's relatively low fuel consumption compared to heavier vehicles. The Continental R975 engine, while powerful, was fairly efficient. The M18 carried 165 gallons of fuel and had an operational range of about 100 miles on roads, more than most comparable vehicles. In the fluid, fast-moving campaigns of 1944-45, this extended range allowed M18 units to keep up with armored advances when other units were stopping to refuel. By December 1944, the M18 Hellcat had proven itself in combat across France and into Germany, but it was about to face its greatest test. December 16, 1944. The Germans launch Operation Wacht am Rhein, better known to history as the Battle of the Bulge. It's Hitler's last great offensive in the West, a massive surprise attack through the Ardennes forest designed to split the Allied armies, recapture the port of Antwerp, and potentially force a negotiated peace. The Germans commit their last strategic reserves: 3 armies, over 200,000 men, 1 in 400 tanks and tank destroyers. The American forces in the Ardennes are thinly stretched, mostly inexperienced units resting after heavy fighting, or new units just arriving in theater. The initial German assault achieves complete surprise. American units are overrun, surrounded, or forced to retreat in disorder. The situation is critical. And into this chaos, the speed of the M18 Hellcat becomes its most valuable asset. Units of the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion are rushed to the town of Neuville, northeast of Bastogne. Bastogne is critical to the entire battle. It's a road junction that the Germans need to capture to maintain their offensive momentum. If Bastogne holds, the German timetable collapses. If it falls, the entire American position in the Ardennes could collapse with it. Team de Sobry, a battalion-sized task force of the 10th Armored Division, is assigned to defend Neuville. They have a few Sherman tanks, some infantry, and 4 M18 Hellcats from the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion. 4 tank destroyers to help hold off elements of the 2nd Panzer Division. The journey to Neuville is where the M18's speed becomes critical. Team de Sobry needs to reach the blocking position before the German spearheads. It's a highway race, American armor rushing to get ahead of the German advance. The M18s, with their 55 mpm top speed, lead the column. They reach Neuville just in time, before the Germans can seize the town. This is one of the few documented cases where the M18's maximum road speed was actually used operationally, and it made all the difference. The Germans attacked Neuville on December 19th and 20th with tanks, mechanized infantry, and artillery support. The 4 M18 Hellcats are the main anti-tank defense for the position, and they perform brilliantly. Using shoot-and-scoot tactics in an urban environment, they engage German tanks, knock them out, and relocate to new firing positions before the Germans can respond. The battle is chaotic, close range, brutal. German tanks are trying to push into the town. American infantry are fighting house to house. And the M18s are racing through the streets, appearing suddenly to ambush German armor, then vanishing into the smoke and ruins. Over 2 days of fighting, the 4 M18s, working with the paratroopers of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment and Team de Sobry's Shermans, destroy at least 30 German tanks. Some accounts credit the M18s specifically with 24 kills, including several Tigers. The Germans are confused and demoralized. They can hear the M18s moving around the battlefield at high speed, but they can't pin them down. The Hellcats appear, fire, and disappear so quickly that German tank commanders struggle to coordinate effective responses. The attack on Neuville stalls. The Germans have suffered 500 to 1,000 casualties and lost dozens of tanks without achieving their objective. The delay is critical. Every hour the Germans are held up at Neuville is an hour the defenders of Bastogne have to prepare. Every German tank destroyed at Neuville is one less tank available for the assault on Bastogne itself. The town eventually falls to the Germans on December 20th, but the American forces conduct an organized withdrawal, and the delay they imposed has disrupted the German timetable permanently. Bastogne will hold, largely because places like Neuville bought enough time for reinforcements to arrive. And the M18 Hellcat is a key reason why Neuville held as long as it did. The performance of the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion at Neuville becomes legendary. Military historians later credit the M18's ability to shoot and scoot at high speed with creating confusion in the German attack, making the defenders seem more numerous and better positioned than they actually were. The psychological effect of the M18s appearing from unexpected directions, firing and vanishing again, was significant. German after-action reports note their frustration at being unable to bring the American tank destroyers to a decisive engagement. After the Battle of the Bulge, the reputation of the M18 Hellcat is secure. Even skeptics have to admit that the design works. The vehicles that Bradley didn't want, that the armored ground forces tried to cancel, have achieved a combat record that speaks for itself. But here's where the story takes a frustrating turn. Even after proving itself repeatedly, the M18 continues to be controversial within the Army establishment. The armored ground forces still prefer the M36 with its 90mm gun. Towed anti-tank gun advocates argue that self-propelled tank destroyers are unnecessary. And most significantly, by early 1945, the tank destroyer force itself is being questioned. The doctrinal assumptions that created the force have been proven wrong in combat. German tank tactics don't involve massed breakthrough attempts that require separate tank destroyer units to counter them. Instead, German armor is integrated into combined arms defenses, which means that American tanks are constantly fighting German tanks, regardless of what doctrine says they should be doing. Field commanders ignore the doctrine and use their M18s however they need them. Sometimes that means tank destroyer missions. Sometimes it means infantry support. Sometimes it means reconnaissance, exploitation, or even artillery. The M18's versatility makes it useful in roles that were never envisioned by the original doctrine. But this versatility also proves that the separate tank destroyer force concept was unnecessary. If M18s can do all these missions, why do they need to be in a separate organization? Why not just build them as light tanks and integrate them into armored divisions? This debate will continue even after the war ends. The tank destroyer force will be disbanded. The M18 will be retired from U.S. service almost immediately after VE Day, despite its combat record. The only exception is a variant called the M39 Armored Utility Vehicle, which is basically an M18 with the turret removed and the hull modified to carry cargo or personnel. These serve in the Korean War, but as utility vehicles, not combat vehicles. By 1950, the M18 Hellcat is essentially gone from American service, but its final statistics tell a remarkable story. When the dust settled and the historians began tallying scores, the numbers for the M18 Hellcat were remarkable. Total kills claimed 526 German armored vehicles, 498 in Europe, 17 in Italy, 11 in the Pacific. The kill-to-loss ratio for Europe, 2.3 to 1. Overall kill-to-loss ratio, 2.4 to 1. This is the highest kill-to-loss ratio of any American tank or tank destroyer in World War II. Let me repeat that. The highest kill-to-loss ratio of any American armored vehicle. Better than the Sherman, better than the M10, better than the M36, better than every other tank destroyer. The vehicle that was rejected, criticized, and nearly canceled had achieved the best combat record of its entire class. But statistics only tell part of the story. The real impact of the M18 was in how it changed tactical thinking. Before the Hellcat, American tank destroyer doctrine was defensive and reactive. Wait for German tanks to attack, then counterattack against their flanks. The M18 proved that offensive operations, aggressive maneuvering, and constant pressure could be just as effective, maybe more so. The M18 commanders didn't wait for German tanks to come to them. They went hunting. They used their speed to dictate the terms of engagement. They forced German armor to react to them rather than the other way around. This was a fundamental shift in how tank destroyers were employed, and it was only possible because of the M18's unique design characteristics. The lessons learned from M18 operations influenced post-war American armor doctrine. The emphasis on mobility over protection, the value of rapid fire and rapid repositioning, the importance of crew training and initiative, the need for vehicles that could do multiple missions rather than just one specialized role. All of these lessons came from Hellcat operations. But despite this successful combat record, the M18 design wasn't adopted for post-war service. Why? Part of the answer is that the entire tank destroyer force concept was being abandoned. The Army was reorganizing for the Cold War, and separate tank destroyer units didn't fit the new structure. Tank versus tank combat would be handled by tanks, not by specialized destroyers in separate battalions. But another part of the answer is more frustrating. The armored ground forces, which had opposed the M18 from the beginning, won the bureaucratic battle even though they lost the tactical argument. The post-war American tank development focused on heavier vehicles with bigger guns and more armor. The M26 Pershing, which entered service in the last months of the war, weighed 46 tons and mounted a 90mm gun. This was the direction the Army wanted to go. Bigger, heavier, more powerful. The M18's philosophy of speed over armor, mobility over protection, was considered outdated before the war even ended. This is particularly ironic, given that the German army had come to exactly the opposite conclusion. Late-war German tank design was moving toward lighter, faster vehicles because their heavy tanks like the Tiger and King Tiger had proven to be maintenance nightmares. The King Tiger, which weighed 69.8 tons, was nearly impossible to recover if disabled. Its drivetrain failures were legendary. Its fuel consumption was catastrophic. It was arguably the most powerful tank in the war, but it spent more time broken down than in combat. The Germans began to realize that a lighter, more reliable tank that could actually reach the battlefield was more valuable than a super-heavy tank that spent most of its time in the repair depot. But by then, it was too late. The war was lost. The Americans, having won the war, felt no need to change their approach. If heavy tanks and assault guns worked, why question them? The M18's success was treated as an anomaly, not as a proof of concept. After the war, American armor doctrine emphasized firepower and protection over mobility for decades. It wasn't until the M1 Abrams tank in the 1980s that the U.S. military fully embraced the concept of using mobility as protection. And even then, the Abrams weighs 60 tons, far heavier than the M18. But the M18 story doesn't end with American retirement. Several other countries received M18s through military aid programs. Venezuela used them for decades. Yugoslavia had a small fleet that saw action in the Yugoslav wars of the 1990s. Yes, you read that correctly. M18 Hellcats, designed in 1943, were still seeing combat 50 years later in the Balkans. The last M18s weren't retired from military service until 1995. 50 years of service life for a design that was supposed to be too light, too specialized, too radical. Today, surviving M18 Hellcats are treasured by military vehicle collectors and museums. They're relatively rare since only 2,507 were built, and most were scrapped after the war. But every time one appears at a demonstration or museum event, it still turns heads. Because even today, watching an M18 accelerate, watching it maneuver, watching how quickly it can get from one position to another, you understand immediately why German tank crews learned to fear it. The story of the M18 Hellcat is a story about innovation versus establishment, about tactical reality versus doctrinal theory, and about how sometimes the best solution is the one that breaks all the rules. When Harley Earl and the Buick engineering team designed the M18, they weren't constrained by military tradition. They approached the problem from first principles. How do you create a vehicle that can kill enemy tanks and survive? Their answer was radical. Forget armor. Forget defensive tactics. Build something so fast and so agile that it doesn't need heavy armor because it simply won't be there when the enemy shoots back. The military establishment hated this idea. It violated decades of doctrine. It seemed reckless, even suicidal. But the crews who drove M18s in combat understood its genius. They understood that speed was protection, that mobility created opportunities, that fighting on your own terms was better than any amount of armor plate. The M18 Hellcat achieved the highest kill-to-loss ratio of any American armored vehicle in World War II, not because it was the most powerful or the most protected, but because its design perfectly matched the tactical reality of mobile warfare. It could get to the right place at the right time, engage from an advantageous position, and be gone before the enemy could respond. That's how you win in armored warfare, not by standing and trading shots until the vehicle with the thickest armor wins, but by never letting the enemy get a shot at all. The rejection of the M18 by military leadership, even in the face of overwhelming combat success, is a cautionary tale about institutional resistance to innovation. How many other breakthrough designs have been rejected because they didn't fit preconceived notions? How many potentially war-winning ideas have been strangled in development because they threatened established doctrine or bureaucratic interests? We'll never know. But the M18 Hellcat stands as proof that sometimes the crazy idea, the rejected proposal, the design that breaks all the rules, turns out to be exactly what's needed. The German tank crews who faced M18 Hellcats in combat didn't care about doctrine or procurement debates. They just knew that there was an American vehicle out there that could appear from nowhere, destroy their tank, and vanish before they could even react. They learned to fear the distinctive low profile and the sound of that Continental radial engine at high speed. They called it the Hellcat long before they knew that was its official nickname, because that's exactly what it was. A predator that struck from ambush and disappeared into the landscape. Today, when military historians analyze World War II tank combat, the M18 Hellcat represents a road not taken. What if the Army had fully embraced the speed over armor philosophy? What if post-war tank development had followed the M18's example, rather than the trend toward heavier vehicles? What if mobility had been prioritized over protection? We got glimpses of this alternative future in designs like the M551 Sheridan, but they were never fully realized. The modern U.S. Army still fields heavy armored vehicles, still values protection over mobility, still builds tanks that rely on armor rather than speed. Maybe they're right. Modern warfare is different from World War II. Or maybe we forgot the lessons that the M18 Hellcat tried to teach us. Either way, the story of the M18 Hellcat is a reminder that innovation often comes from unexpected places, that breakthrough designs are usually controversial, that the best solution might be the one that everyone says won't work, and that sometimes the vehicle that gets rejected turns out to be the one that changes everything. The M18 Hellcat, rejected by generals, built by car designers, feared by enemies, and the deadliest tank destroyer America ever built.